In the previous video, we have looked at how the income level in the economy is going to be impacted given that we have different monetary or fiscal policy implemented by the government in a fixed exchange rate regime. Let's say that the currency has a flexible exchange rate. How will that impact the income in the economy given monetary or fiscal policies? Let's say the government tries to implement expansionary fiscal policies by increasing government spending. So if government spending increases, what's going to happen? And just keep in mind, for the sake of explanation, you can also have contractionary fiscal policy, and the effect is going to be exactly the same as expansionary fiscal policy, except that we would have an inverse, consequence. So whatever I'm explaining over here, if you just flip it around, that would be true if you have a contractionary fiscal policy implemented. So if the government increases government spending, we know from our basic economic understanding that the IS curve would shift towards the right. So the IS curve shifts outwards towards the right, and this would create a new equilibrium output. Oh, hold on a second. Forgot to sketch the balance of payment. Okay, balance of payment line. So what's going to happen? The income in the economy or the output in the economy is going to increase. So we would have a shift from y0 to y1, and also at the same time the output, oh sorry, my bad, should not have written there. This is interest rate, this is R, and because this is a perfectly mobile capital situation, we assume that our domestic interest rate is the same as our international interest rate. So if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, our interest rate domestically is going to increase to R1, and because our domestic interest rate is greater than the international interest rate, we know that we will have a capital inflow, and we have discussed in the previous video why we would have a capital inflow. And when we have this capital inflow, we would also have an appreciation of the currency, appreciation of the exchange rate. And because this is a flexible exchange rate, the government would not intervene in the economy to fix that exchange rate back to normal. The government would leave the exchange rate as is. The government would not want to do anything to the exchange rate. However, what's going to happen because of market forces or because of situation in the market? One thing that you have to keep in mind, all the points above the balance of payment line would indicate that we have a balance of payment surplus, and all the points below, all the points essentially over here, would indicate that we have a balance of payment deficit. Since we have a balance of payment, and that makes sense intuitively also, just a side tangent, the balance of payment equation essentially is your export, which is a function of domestic income, domestic income and exchange rate, and plus your import, which is a function of foreign income and exchange rate, plus our capital inflows or outflows. So we have R and we have R, hold on a second, we have R minus R star, which is the international interest rate. This is slightly a side tangent, but keep in mind, whenever we have a point above the balance of payment line, mathematically speaking, we would have a surplus in the balance of payment, and any point below would give us, mathematically speaking, a deficit of balance of payment. And why? Because there is a mathematical equation that you can use to calculate if you have a question, but this is slightly too advanced at this level. So just keep in mind that whenever we have any point above the balance of payment, that will indicate balance of payment surplus. Any point below would be a balance of payment deficit. In this situation, we see that we have a point above the balance of payment line that would indicate that we have a balance of payment surplus. So we have a surplus of balance of payment. We will not get into whether the surplus, I hope my spelling is correct. I'm not good with spellings. Let's hope that the surplus is, for the sake of argument, we will not go into whether the surplus is financial or current account surplus. Let's assume that we have a balance of payment surplus overall. So what's going to happen? We know that whenever we have a balance of payment of surplus, we would have a increase in imports. Our imports would increase and our exports would decrease. Now, how does that make sense? if you think about intuitively, if the exchange rate increases, what's going to happen? If the exchange rate increases, domestic consumers, let's say we have domestic income would increase in terms of its purchasing power. So let's say if I have initially, let me see if I can write it down clearly. Let's say if I have initially $100 and I'm using the $100 to buy, let's say 10 units. Let's say I'm using the $100 to buy 10 units of our exports, and let's say for some reason my $100 has, because of appreciation of my currency, now I can buy 11 units of, international products. So what's happening over here? We are able to buy more imports, so our imports are going to increase. What about exports? If we switch from domestic goods to foreign goods, our domestic market will suffer, and if the domestic market suffer, domestic companies will not make enough profit, and theoretically speaking their exports will decline, at least in the long run. So we have a decline in exports and we have an incline in our imports. And whenever we have such a situation, we know that the IS curve, which we have learned from our previous video, is comprises of government spending, then we have investments, and we also have net exports. So if our imports are increasing and exports are decreasing, we are going to have a decline in net exports. And when we have a decline in net exports, the IS curve would shift back to its original position. So we would initially go from Y0 to Y1, and because of decline in exports, we will go from Y1 back to Y0. And if you want, you can draw a Keynesian cross diagram along with it to explain this in more details, but since I'm trying to keep it very concise and simple, I won't try to make it even more complicated. So essentially, if we have a flexible exchange rate, this policy, expansionary fiscal policy, is going to be ineffective in the economy, in the sense that overall our Y is essentially the same. Our income level in the long run is still the same, even though we have slight improvement in the short run. So now let's look at a different situation of the government trying to use its monetary policy. We know from our basic economics again that whenever we have an expansionary monetary policy, we would have a shift of the LM curve towards the right. So let's assume that this point over here is our R, domestic R, which is equal to the international R, and we make the assumption because this is a perfectly mobile economy. And let's say that the initial income is, let's say that is Y0. So what's going to happen if our LM curve shifts towards the right? As you can probably see, our income in the economy is going to increase from Y0 to Y1, and our domestic interest rate is going to decline from R0, so we call it R0, to R1, and that would imply if the LM, so let me write it down, hold on a second. If the money supply in the economy increases, the LM curve would shift towards the right. See if I can write on top. The LM curve will shift towards the right. When the LM curve shifts towards the right, we have an increase in income from Y0 to Y1. Along with the LM curve shifting towards the right, we also have the domestic interest rate less than the international interest rate. And we know that when we have our domestic interest rate less than the international interest rate, we are going to have a capital outflow, because the investors would see more benefit in investing their money abroad. And we also know that if we have a point below the balance of payment line, we will have a balance of payment deficit. So since we have a capital outflow, along with that we have a balance of payment deficit, this is going to cause the currency to depreciate. The currency's value is gonna decrease. Now if this was a fixed exchange regime, the government would intervene to try to control the exchange rate, try to bring the exchange rate back to normal. But because this is a flexible exchange rate, the government would not intervene. However, since we have a deficit, what's going to happen to our net exports and net imports? We know that whenever we have a depreciation of the currency, domestic consumers, so let's say that we have a domestic consumer, Let's say the domestic consumer again has $100 as his income. Well, if the current, let's say with the $100 he was buying, let's say, I don't know, 10 units of international products. So if the currency depreciates, he will no longer be able to buy those 10 units because he will have to pay more money. The money value has decreased, or the buying power has decreased internationally. So let's say now he can only buy, for some reason, let's say he can only buy 8 units of those products that he was consuming from abroad. So what would the rational consumer do? What would a rational consumer do? A rational consumer say, hey, I'm no longer able to buy the same amount of unit internationally. Let me switch to domestic market. Let me switch to domestic products. So let's say that if I was buying cheese from abroad, and now instead of buying cheese from abroad, I might buy cheese from the domestic market, from domestic suppliers. So what's going to happen when we have a depreciation of exchange rate? We would have an appreciation, or we would have an increase in our exports, and we would have a decrease in our imports. So therefore our net exports would increase, and we know that whenever we have an increase in net exports, we would have the IS curve shift towards the right, which I hope at this stage you guys do understand. So the IS curve shift towards the right. In the long run, we will come back to our initial level of interest rates. So R will come back to R star, because we're assuming that this is we're assuming that this is a perfectly mobile market, and our income would increase from Y0, from Y1 to Y2. So overall, this policy is going to be very, very effective. This policy is going to be very effective. Initially, we will have an increase from Y0 to Y1. Then we would have an increase from Y1 to Y2 because of increase in net exports. So overall, we are going from Y0 all the way to Y2, giving a very effective policy measure. So to summarize it again, fiscal policy in a flexible exchange rate is ineffective, whereas monetary policy in a flexible exchange rate is effective when we are trying to influence the output level in the economy.